In a glass-walled boardroom, a black CEO extended her hand across the table, confident, composed, and live on camera. The chairwoman didn't stand. She smirked, lifted her palm, and said quietly, "We don't do that with people like you." The room froze. A few nervous laughs followed. Millions watching the investor stream saw the humiliation in real time. What no one understood in that moment was this: Nova Monroe wasn't asking for respect. She was measuring consequences. Because by the next morning, $2.4 billion would disappear without a single apology. So what happens when racism meets real power and misjudges it? Comment and tell us where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And subscribe for more powerful stories that demand to be heard. Before the cameras, before the silence that would ripple through markets, Nova Monroe lived in a world built on precision. Her mornings began before sunrise, reviewing numbers that most people never saw and decisions that quietly shaped entire industries. As CEO of Monroe Capital, Nova had earned her place through discipline, patience, and an unshakable understanding of how power actually moved. She did not inherit influence. She calculated it, protected it, and multiplied it. To the outside world, Nova's life looked polished: corner offices, international calls, private flights. But behind that image was a woman who had learned early that excellence did not shield black women from scrutiny. Every achievement came with extra weight. Every success was met with doubt that rarely followed her peers. Still, Nova moved forward, knowing that restraint was often mistaken for weakness by people who had never needed it to survive. The upcoming merger with Sloan Industries was supposed to be routine. Months of negotiations had narrowed into a single final meeting, one last confirmation before billions shifted hands. For Nova, it was business, an expansion move backed by careful modeling from her analysts and guarded optimism from investors watching closely. For the boardroom awaiting her, however, it was something else entirely. Sloan Industries occupied the upper floors of Langston Tower, a space designed to impress before a word was spoken. Glass walls, steel accents, and a long table where executives sat like silent judges. At the center of it all was Victoria Sloan, the chairwoman whose reputation was built on dominance masked as decorum. Victoria had spent decades shaping the culture of that room, and everyone inside understood the unspoken rules, even when they were never written down. As Nova prepared to enter that boardroom, nothing on her calendar suggested confrontation. Yet beneath the surface, tension already existed. Subtle shifts in tone during prior calls, a hesitation in emails that should have been direct, signals small enough to ignore but familiar enough to recognize. Racism, Nova knew, rarely announced itself loudly at first. It tested boundaries quietly, watching to see who would challenge it. Investors were already tuned in through a live stream. Analysts stood by with projections ready, and the executives waited with polite expressions that revealed very little. What none of them acknowledged, what they assumed, was that Nova would endure whatever came next in silence, as she always had before. They did not yet realize that this time, silence would not mean submission. The moment Nova entered the boardroom, the atmosphere shifted. Not dramatically, not openly, but in the subtle way power announces itself when it believes it owns the room. Conversations softened, chairs adjusted, eyes lifted just long enough to assess before looking away. The executives sat in a neat formation, hands folded, expressions polished. The board members observed in silence, already aligned with the culture they had helped protect for years. Nova took her seat with calm precision. She had walked into rooms like this her entire career, rooms where her presence was questioned before her credentials were considered. She had learned to read the temperature quickly. This one was cold. The meeting began on schedule. Numbers appeared on the glass screen behind Victoria, projections clean and confident. The CFO outlined the financial structure with rehearsed certainty, while analysts from Monroe Capital followed along remotely, tracking every assumption. On the surface, it looked like a standard corporate exchange. But underneath, something else was happening. Victoria controlled the rhythm. She interrupted selectively. She redirected questions meant for Nova. She lingered on critiques that bordered on condescension, framing them as concern while allowing the executives to smirk behind their laptops. Each moment was small on its own, easy to dismiss, easier to excuse, but together they formed a pattern Nova knew too well. When Nova attempted to clarify a valuation model, Victoria waved a hand dismissively and corrected her mid-sentence. A few executives chuckled, emboldened by the signal from the top. The board members remained still, their silence louder than agreement. The live stream continued uninterrupted, broadcasting every second to investors and financial media watching from offices around the world. Nova said little. She listened. She observed who laughed, who looked away, who leaned back comfortably while disrespect unfolded in real time. Her restraint was deliberate. She understood that reactions were often weaponized against people who looked like her. Emotion would be labeled instability. Defense would be reframed as aggression. So she chose stillness. Then came the moment that crystallized everything. As the discussion paused briefly, Nova stood and extended her hand across the table, a professional gesture, routine by every standard. The room seemed to inhale at once. Victoria did not rise. She leaned back, lips curling into a smile that carried no warmth. "We don't shake hands with people like you." The words landed with surgical precision, not loud, not shouted, quiet enough to sound intentional. The silence that followed was thick, punctuated only by a few uneasy laughs that rippled from one end of the table to the other. Someone coughed. Someone else adjusted their tie. No one spoke up. The cameras caught everything. Nova's hand remained extended for a brief moment before she lowered it slowly, her expression unreadable. She returned to her seat without a word. To the executives, it looked like submission. To the board members, it looked like avoidance. To the investors watching live, it looked like something deeply wrong, but still uncertain enough to question. What they did not see was the shift behind Nova's eyes. The meeting resumed as if nothing had happened. Victoria continued speaking, her confidence sharpened now, her authority unchallenged. She criticized projections, questioned leadership assumptions, and framed Monroe Capital's approach as ambitious, in a tone that suggested recklessness rather than vision. Each remark was met with nods, murmurs of agreement, and the quiet comfort of people who believed consequences applied only to others. At 3:17 p.m. during a short recess, Nova stepped into the hallway. The glass walls blurred behind her as she dialed a single number. Her voice was low, controlled. "Execute Clause 8.3, effective immediately." There was no explanation needed, no hesitation on the other end. When Nova returned to the boardroom, nothing appeared different. Victoria barely looked up. The executives resumed their seats. The board members whispered among themselves, unaware that the ground beneath them had already begun to shift. Minutes passed. Then phones began to buzz, one alert, then another. The CFO froze mid-scroll, color draining from his face as emails stacked faster than he could read them. He cleared his throat, voice unsteady, and addressed Victoria. "Our primary funding, Monroe Capital, it's been withdrawn." The room erupted. Executives spoke over one another, disbelief colliding with panic. Board members leaned forward, demanding answers. Screens refreshed. Numbers changed. The stock ticker trembled, red replacing green in real time. Financial media notifications began lighting up across devices worldwide. Victoria turned toward Nova, her composure cracking for the first time. "This isn't funny," she said sharply. Nova met her gaze, calm, unmoved. "It's contractual." The realization hit slowly, then all at once. Clause 8.3, signed months ago, approved by their own legal team. A provision allowing immediate withdrawal in the event of documented misconduct, especially during live negotiations. The live stream camera blinked quietly in the corner. By the time anyone thought to turn it off, the damage was already irreversible. The boardroom no longer felt controlled. What had once been a polished arena of confidence collapsed into noise, movement, and fear. Executives stood halfway from their seats, voices overlapping, hands shaking as screens refreshed again and again. The numbers refused to stabilize. Each update confirmed what they were only beginning to understand. This was not a scare tactic. This was real. Victoria stood frozen at the head of the table, one hand gripping the edge as if the room itself were tilting. Her authority, once unquestioned, now felt brittle. She demanded answers, turning sharply toward the CFO, but his silence spoke louder than words. The data was irrefutable. The funds were gone. Every dollar that anchored Sloan Industries' stability had been pulled with surgical precision. Across the table, Nova remained seated. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply watched as the weight of consequence settled into the room. For the first time since the meeting began, no one spoke over her presence. The executives who had laughed earlier now avoided her gaze. The board members shifted uncomfortably, realizing too late that their silence had been a choice, and that choices carried costs. Financial media alerts spread faster than the panic inside the room. Investors reacted in real time, selling off positions, flooding markets with uncertainty. The live stream, still running, transmitted every second of collapse to the outside world. What had begun as a negotiation had become a public reckoning. Victoria finally turned back to Nova, her voice tighter now, stripped of its earlier ease. She questioned the legality. She challenged the timing. She implied recklessness. Each accusation sounded thinner than the last. The executives listened, but none echoed her confidence. They were already calculating distance, how to separate themselves from what was unfolding. Nova rose slowly. The movement alone shifted the room. Cameras adjusted, phones lowered. Even the board members straightened instinctively. When she spoke, her voice was measured, steady, and unmistakably clear. The clause had been mutual. The terms had been reviewed. The withdrawal had been lawful. And the justification was documented in high definition, broadcast to investors, analysts, and regulators alike. The very room that had dismissed her now served as evidence. The realization landed visibly. Victoria's expression changed, not to anger but to disbelief. Power, she was learning, did not reside where she thought it did. The executives turned inward, whispering urgently. One attempted to contact the PR department. Another stared at the stock ticker as it dropped again. The board members exchanged glances, recognizing that reputations were unraveling alongside valuation. No one spoke in defense of what had been said earlier. No one denied it had happened. Outside the glass walls, phones rang nonstop. Banks began calling in guarantees. Analysts revised forecasts downward. Investors demanded explanations that no one in the room could credibly provide. The story was already writing itself beyond their control. Nova stepped away from the table and gathered her materials. The contrast was striking. While everything else felt chaotic, her movements were precise, intentional, final. Victoria tried once more to regain footing, her voice sharper now, edged with desperation. She appealed to loyalty, to history, to everything that had once worked in her favor, but the room no longer belonged to her. Authority had shifted and everyone felt it. One of the board members finally spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough to be heard. Responsibility, he said, had been misjudged. The damage, he implied, was self-inflicted. That was when the truth fully settled in. This was not about money alone. It was about exposure, about a moment that revealed what had long been normalized behind closed doors. The refusal, the silence, the laughter, all of it now visible, preserved, undeniable. Nova paused near the door, the hum of chaos behind her. She looked back once, not to gloat, not to threaten, but to confirm something important. Power, she knew, was not control over people. It was the ability to choose when to walk away and ensure the consequences followed. As she exited the boardroom, the cameras caught her reflection in the glass. Calm, composed, untouched by the collapse behind her. Inside, Sloan Industries continued to unravel, and outside the world was watching, waiting to see what would fall next. By the end of that day, Sloan Industries no longer resembled the empire it had projected for decades. Markets closed with the company down nearly 40%. Banks tightened credit. Longtime partners distanced themselves quietly, issuing statements filled with neutral language that barely concealed panic. Financial media replayed the boardroom footage on loop, dissecting every second, not just the financial fallout, but the moment that triggered it. Nova did not return calls. She did not grant interviews. She released a single written statement through Monroe Capital that was brief and deliberate. Partnerships do not survive the absence of respect. Nothing more was needed. The message traveled faster than any press tour ever could. Inside Sloan Industries, the consequences deepened. The board members launched internal reviews. The PR department scrambled to contain reputational damage that could not be contained. Executives who had laughed in silence now faced shareholders demanding accountability. What had once been dismissed as a misunderstanding was now publicly recognized as something far more familiar and far more uncomfortable. Victoria's fall was swift and public. Within days, her leadership was under formal review. The same authority that once shielded her now dissolved under scrutiny. In interviews she never gave, and statements she could not undo, the truth remained unchanged. A single moment of racial disrespect had exposed an entire culture built on entitlement. For Nova, the outcome was not victory in the traditional sense. It was confirmation. Confirmation that restraint did not equal weakness. That dignity did not require permission. And that racism, when confronted with transparency and consequence, could no longer hide behind polished language or powerful titles. Business schools later analyzed the incident as a case study, not just for the financial mechanics, but for the human cost of silence. In offices around the world, black professionals replayed the clip quietly, recognizing something deeply personal in it: the hesitation, the calculation, the decision to endure or to act. This was never just about a handshake. It was about who is expected to tolerate humiliation to keep peace, and who is allowed to define professionalism on their own terms. It was about how often racism survives not through outrage, but through acceptance. Nova moved forward without spectacle, continuing her work as she always had, precise, intentional, and unapologetic. The difference was that now, the world had watched what happened when disrespect met resolve. And the question left behind was simple, but unsettling. How many moments like this have gone unseen? And how many more will it take before silence finally becomes too expensive to maintain? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen. And don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.